Like and subscribe. On the way in the door, people. Today, I want to talk about a topic that I feel. I want to talk about a topic that I feel to be a misconception of one of the greatest, if not the greatest rapper to ever do it, Tupac Shakur. And that is this, to me, what I believe is a misconception that he wasn't a real gangster or wasn't a real thug. And people often like to bring up the interview with him as a 17-year-old kid, you know, as evidence of, look, see how he was. And here's my perspective on that. First of all, let me start by saying this. There is a great interview on the Holding Court podcast, I believe it's called, and it's with a guy named Ray Love, who knew Tupac and was friends with him at the time doing that 17-year-old interview, when he was 17 years old in that interview. And you should check that interview out, because he talks about the fact, he said, you know, everybody tries to point out that 17-year-old interview, and he says, Tupac, he said, that same kid, and that's, you know, in that interview at 17 years old, was fighting grown men every day because he would not tolerate being disrespected. He would not tolerate his friends being disrespected. So, you know, to me, this whole notion of using that interview because he seems soft-spoken and, you know, some feminine quality, so to speak, in his mannerisms and stuff. You know, you can't make a bunch of assumptions just because you see that interview. You know, obviously now how he talked as he got older was a lot different than that interview. But like the guy from the podcast, well, he was a guest on the podcast, Ray Love was saying, he said in that interview, Tupac was fighting grown men every day because he would not tolerate being disrespected. And he actually told some great stories on that interview, which gave even more insight to Tupac. So, you know, and then this is something else to consider. I feel like a 17-year-old kid, you know, at that time, as intelligent as Tupac was, you know, he might have just been trying to put his best foot forward in that interview, you know. So, you're making a lot of assumptions. People make a lot of assumptions off that interview. The other thing I would have to say is, I think, you know, people see it as Tupac flip-flopped. I see it as Tupac evolved. I see it like this. To me, some of the hardest people are actually the most sensitive people. And I think that is because, you know, they have to put up a hard exterior to protect that sensitiveness. You know, that knowing that there's something seriously wrong with this world and how people can be treated in this world. And I think Tupac was like that. So I think Tupac evolved, you know, coming from that Black Panther background. He already had a soldier's heart. I mean, that's who he was. But as he, you know, got into the rap game and through his life experiences, I think it just turned him harder and colder. But yeah, I feel like it's too many stories out there about Tupac to be trying to say that it was an act. You know, listen to interviews with Spice One. You know, Spice One has some crazy stories about Pac. There's even some crazy stories coming from Scarface of the Ghetto Boys. Some crazy stories about Pac. So Pac has, and again, going back to that interview with Ray Love on the Holding Court podcast, saying that, hey, that interview where Tupac was 17, he was fighting grown men every day because he would not tolerate being disrespected. So Tupac always was not going for it. Like, he was going to stand up for himself. It didn't matter who you were, when it was, or how it had to be. That was just him. he was a soldier like that. And like I said, I think he evolved over time. Now, I do think getting on death row pushed him in a direction he didn't need to be going, in the sense that I think he was hanging with people who didn't really have his best interests at heart. And he seemed like the kind of person to be loyal to a fault. So he had loyalty to people who didn't necessarily have his best interests at heart. But as far as, being less or more gangster because of it, I don't think that was the case. The whole night of the Tyson fight, where he got in a fight with Orlando Anderson, to me that was not Tupac trying to prove his gangster. That was Tupac being Tupac, a loyal person who, So let me go ahead and tell you a little bit of this story, tell you the gist of this story that Ray Love told, because I think it gives insight into the night of the Vegas incident. So Ray Love said that, and I go watch this podcast, because I'm not gonna tell it like he tells it. But the gist of it was, Ray Love said that a friend of his had got jumped by some grown men, and after the fight, I guess him and his friend went to Tupac's house. He told Tupac what happened, and Tupac immedately got them together and went back to confront all of these grown men. And it was a lot of them. I think it was a lot of them. I think he said it was 30 of them or something. But Tupac wasn't having it. And he said Tupac went up and was like, which one of y'all jumped my friend? And the funny thing is, Tupac didn't even know the guy who got jumped. He was just a friend of Tupac's friend. So Tupac always had that loyalty and that desire to stand up for the underdog. If you looked at my other video, that's one of the things I said. It's like Tupac took up for the underdog. He made it cool to be an underdog. He gave hope to the underdogs. So Tupac always stood up, for the person who was being bullied and for his friends. So the night of the Vegas thing, to me, that wasn't Tupac. People look at it like, oh, he shouldn't have been getting in gang business and stuff. And yeah, somebody should have stopped that from happening. But it wasn't like Tupac was trying to be a gangster. Like the guy with Orlando Anderson was pointed out to him as someone who had jumped his friend in the mall and took the chain or whatever, or tried to take the chain, whatever it was. And Tupac reacted how he has always reacted. This is not nothing new. If you've heard the story about, I think he was in Milwaukee on stage and confronted a crowd full of GDs over a little kid getting shot. I can't remember if the kid, 11-year-old, 13. Anyway, it was a young kid that got shot in some gang activity. And Tupac took it upon himself to confront an audience full of GDs. Like, this is not him. It's not an act. It's who he was at the core. And to me, the whole thug life thing, that was just a label and way of connecting to the underdogs of society. And to me, he said as much in that interview with I can't remember, Ed Gordon. In the interview with Ed Gordon, he talks about, he said, how can I, especially now that I'm successful, I'm making money, I got jewelry, and how can I come to a community center and talk to poor people talking about we, when I clearly have more money? But he was like, now when I say we, they know what I mean. It's like, I'm a thug and they're thugs. And I think thug was more of a reference of the underdogs of society. And so I would argue that Tupac had more heart than a lot of these gangsters out here. Because my thing with this is like, these gangsters are turning the gun on people who look like them instead of standing up for a greater purpose. The whole incident with Tupac in Atlanta and the off-duty officers, because he thought, because they were bullying somebody, basically. Again, really, this is what it comes down to, right? They were bullying somebody, and Tupac intervened. He wasn't having it. This is in line with how Tupac has always been. And like I said, that interview with Ray Love on the Holding Court podcast, he knew Tupac as a 17-year-old kid. And he confirmed, like, this is how Pac has always been. You know, in his interviews with Michael Jai White talking about he hung out with Tupac one time. It's like, again, this is why I'm talking about the greatness of Tupac. Everybody has multiple sides to them. You know, I've lived a lot of different types of lives. And some people don't know about, you know, some of the stuff I've done in my past. But most of humanity, you know, has multiple sides to them. And to me, Tupac was representative of that. So when Michael Jai White says, yeah, you know, him when he was 17 in the interview and talking like this, and then I met him and we hung out and he was cool and blah, 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 you know, I feel like that's human nature, right? But it wasn't an act. It was just he had multiple sides to himself. And depending on who he was around, you know, it's kind of depending on what side you would see. You know, if he was surrounded by people who didn't live that kind of life, you know, it's like, for all you know, maybe he was doing that so that you felt more comfortable. Or maybe he was doing that because he didn't have to have his guard up, so to speak. You know, but again, to say it was an act, I don't believe so. I believe this Tupac was the same core fundamental person as he had always been. And if you listen to stories through people who knew him well, not people who just encountered him or just knew him on the surface. If you listen to stories from people who knew him well, the story remains consistent. And the thing that you can say about Pac is he always stood up for his friends. He was loyal to a fault until you crossed him. And he was kind of, you know, like I said, the spokesperson for the underdog. Yeah. So like I said, I think the incidences of Tupac's life made him harder and harder on the exterior. That's what it was. It wasn't an act. Like the incidents that took place in his life, you know, because there was a change after he got shot at the Quad Studio things. You notice he was a little more guarded than before that happened, and rightfully so. I mean, I don't understand how people don't act like major events in your life can change or shape, you know, how you are as a person. And then, you know, going to jail for the alleged thing that happened that turns out looks like it, well, even when he got convicted of it, it wasn't convicted for what they were trying to make it out to be. It's really like they had to make something up to put him in jail. And so, you know, coming from that Black Panther background, you know, I'm sure he was being watched. And I won't get into that, but I'll just say I'm sure he was being watched from an early age, you know, and I'm sure he was on the radar of a lot of people. But yeah, and this actually takes me into another topic that I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to save it for another video. But this, you know, the whole beef between him and Biggie. But anyway, that's all I got for today. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you believe that Tupac's thug life mentality was an act? And if so, why do you really believe that? And if not, you know, or do you believe like me? You know, I think Tupac was as genuine as it comes, because all the stories are consistent. And again, I'm going to say this one last time. Go look at the Holding Court podcast with Ray Love on there. Someone who knew Tupac during those teenage years. And like I said, the story he tells, again, if you listen to the multiple stories told by different people who really knew him, the information is consistent. And it lines up with him, with Tupac being a loyal person who was not going to tolerate being disrespected, who was not going to tolerate anyone picking on him or his friends or people who was close to him. You know, he was just a loyal guy. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. You all have a great day, and I'll see you next time. All right.